She had buried her husband with one hand and held her children with the other. She had fought drought, debt, and the quiet cruelty of a town waiting for her to fail. For 6 years, Mara Calloway had been the wall standing between her children and ruin. And tonight, that wall was about to crack. A knock came at the door. Not the knock of a neighbor, not the knock of a friend. The knock of a stranger who would change everything. A man carrying secrets heavier than the Montana snow pressing down on her roof. She should have turned him away. She didn't. If this story grips you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far Frost Creek travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while, and every minute is worth it. The wind came down from the Beartooth Mountains like something personal. It wasn't the kind of cold that merely stole warmth from your skin. It was the kind that found the gaps in your walls, crept under your collar, and settled into the bones like a debt that would never fully be repaid. In November, the high plains of Montana stopped pretending to be hospitable. The land simply became what it always was, enormous, indifferent, and brutally honest about who belonged there and who did not. Mara Calloway belonged there. She had decided that years ago, and she had been paying the price for that decision every single day since. She stood at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee she'd already reheated twice, watching the last of the daylight surrender to the tree line. The temperature outside had dropped 14 degrees since noon. She knew because she had checked the thermometer on the porch post 3 times, each reading worse than the last, mentally calculating how long the propane would last, whether the pipes under the barn floor would hold, whether the 2 remaining pregnant heifers could survive a hard freeze without additional bedding. These were the calculations that lived behind her eyes now. Not dreams, not plans. Calculations. Survival arithmetic that ran on a constant loop in the background of every conversation, every meal, every moment she closed her eyes and tried to pretend she was sleeping. Mom. Her eldest, Clara, stood in the doorway of the kitchen, 14 years old and wearing that particular expression she'd developed sometime in the last year. Not quite a child's worry, not quite an adult's resignation. Something caught between. Beans are ready. Set 4 bowls, Mara said without turning from the window. Eli already ate half the cornbread. Then set 3 bowls and tell Eli his cornbread privileges are revoked until he's 30. A ghost of a smile crossed Claire's face, there and gone, like something she couldn't quite afford. He'll just eat more beans then. Let him. Beans are cheap. That was the Calloway household in November. Jokes about what was cheap. Jokes because the alternative was silence, and silence in a house this cold had a way of becoming something heavier than any of them could carry. Mara turned from the window and moved to help Clara with the bowls. Her youngest, Rosie, was already at the table, 6 years old, and seemingly the only person on the ranch immune to the particular gravity of their situation. Drawing something elaborate on the back of an old feed catalog with a crayon stub she'd rescued from some forgotten corner. Eli, 9 years old and shaped already with the lean, quiet intensity of his father, sat across from her staring at nothing in particular, which meant he was thinking about something he wasn't going to say. Mara had learned not to push Eli. He was too much like Tom for that. He'd come to the words when he was ready, and if she crowded him, he'd swallow them entirely, and she'd never know what had been sitting behind his eyes. Tom. 4 years, 3 months, and she stopped counting. She had made herself stop counting somewhere around the 2-year mark because the specificity of it had started to feel like a wound she kept pressing instead of letting close. Thomas Aaron Calloway had been thrown from a horse on a Wednesday afternoon in August, on a stretch of his own land he'd ridden 1,000 times. There was no drama to it, no flood, no fire, no villain, just a gopher hole hidden in tall grass, a horse that stumbled, and a man who fell at the wrong angle and never got back up. The doctor in Billings said it was instantaneous. Mara had held on to that word for a long time, turning it over like a stone. Instantaneous. As though speed was the mercy. As though the absence of suffering on his end meant the suffering on hers was somehow balanced out. It wasn't. She had been 29 years old with 3 children, 200 acres of Montana rangeland, and a mortgage that didn't care about any of it. 6 years later, she was still here. That in itself was the accomplishment. The neighbors didn't say it out loud, Not to her face, but she'd caught enough half-finished sentences and knowing glances at the feed store and the diner on Main Street to know exactly what Frost Creek thought, that it was only a matter of time, that a woman alone couldn't hold that much land through that many hard winters, that she'd eventually take what Vern Rucker was offering and move herself and those kids into town like a sensible person would. Sensible. The word sat wrong in Mara's chest like a swallowed stone. She ladled beans into the bowls and sat down, and for a few minutes the only sounds in the kitchen were spoons against ceramic and Rosie narrating her drawing to no one in particular, something about a horse that could fly and a mountain that was actually a sleeping giant. "Mom," Eli said finally in that careful way of his. "Yeah. Rucker's man came by again today while you were fixing the north fence." Mara kept her eyes on her bowl. "What did he say?" "Same as before, that Mr. Rucker's offer is—" Eli paused, clearly repeating words he'd memorized. "Time-sensitive and won't improve with waiting." "He said that to you?" Mara looked up. "He said that to a 9-year-old boy? I told him you weren't home. He said I should make sure you got the message." The anger that moved through Mara was clean and simple, the way real anger often was. Not hot and explosive, but cold and clarifying, like a line drawn in frozen ground. She set her spoon down. "You tell Rucker's man, if he comes back, that this property is not for sale, that it has never been for sale, and that if he sets foot on this land again without my invitation, I will be having a conversation with Sheriff Baines that he is not going to enjoy." Eli nodded once, the way he always did when she said something that confirmed rather than created a belief he'd already formed. Rosie looked up from her drawing. "Is Mr. Rucker the fat man with the hat?" "Rosie, Sarah," Clara began. "Yes," Mara said. "I don't like him," Rosie said simply, and returned to her drawing. Mara looked at her youngest daughter, this small, unbothered creature who experienced the world with a directness that cut straight through every complicated thing, and felt something loosen in her chest, just slightly. Just enough. "Neither do I, baby," she said. "Neither do I." The knock came at 8:30. 3 solid raps against the front door, deliberate enough to be heard over the wind, but not frantic. Not the pounding of someone who had lost their mind to the cold. Not the urgent double knock of news that couldn't wait. Just 3 measured strikes. The knock of a person who was cold and tired and trying not to be a burden about it. Mara had already moved the children toward the back bedrooms. It was their routine when anything unexpected happened after dark. Not a rule she'd ever had to explain, just an understanding that had developed naturally over the years. The way certain instincts did in households where a mother stood as the only adult between her children and whatever the world sent through the door. She took the rifle down from the bracket above the fireplace. Not because she intended to use it, but because she intended not to need to use it, and those were 2 entirely different decisions made by the same hand. She held it low at her side. She went to the door. She opened it. The man on her porch looked like something the storm had assembled and set moving out of sheer indifference. He was tall, taller than the doorframe had suggested from the sound of his knock, broad across the shoulder but carrying himself with the kind of careful stillness that suggested the breadth had been earned rather than inherited. His coat was heavy canvas, dark with moisture, and his hat was pulled low enough that she couldn't immediately read his eyes. He had a pack on one shoulder and nothing else. His hands were visible. She noticed that immediately, hands down at his sides, deliberately clear of his pockets. He'd done this before. Knocked on strangers' doors. He knew enough to make his hands visible. "Evening," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, carrying that specific roughness of someone who hadn't spoken much in recent days. "I apologize for the hour. I came up the access road from the valley and the weather turned faster than I expected. I'm not looking for much, just somewhere out of the wind for the night, if you have it. The barn would be fine." Mara held his gaze. In the light from the doorway, she could see his face clearly now. Not young, not old, somewhere in the hard middle country of a life that had required things of him. There was a beard, several weeks thick. There were lines around his eyes that didn't come from squinting in the sun, but from some interior weather she couldn't name. His eyes themselves were a pale, clear gray, and what she saw in them was the thing that arrested her judgment for a half-second longer than she intended. Exhaustion. Not the exhaustion of a single difficult day, but the profound structural exhaustion of a person who had been tired for so long they'd stopped expecting it to lift. She had seen that look before. She'd seen it in her own mirror. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "North," he said. "That's not an answer." A beat of silence. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She studied him. The rifle was still at her side. He hadn't looked at it, hadn't referenced it, hadn't altered his posture in any direction. He was simply standing in the wind, waiting for her to decide something, making no attempt to influence which way she landed. "You have a name?" "Silas," he said. "Silas Mercer." "You have ID? Silas Mercer?" He reached slowly into his inside coat pocket. She tracked the movement with her full attention and produced a Montana driver's license. He held it toward her without stepping forward. She took it. The photo matched. The name matched. The address listed was in Billings, but the address on a driver's license told you almost nothing about a person. She handed it back. "Mara Calloway," she said. "This is my ranch." "I know you're taking a chance," he said. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking for the barn." She stood there for one more moment in the doorway, with the cold pressing in around both of them and the weight of every reasonable argument against this on one side of the scale, and something she couldn't quite articulate on the other. She stepped back from the door. "Come inside," she said. "I'll heat the beans back up. After that, the barn." He didn't thank her effusively. He didn't apologize again for the trouble. He just nodded once, like a man who understood the value of what he'd been given and didn't intend to diminish it with excess words. He came inside. She fed him at the kitchen table while the children slept. He ate in a way that told her more than any conversation could, with the controlled, deliberate attention of someone reacquainting themselves with the act of eating rather than merely fueling. Not ravenous, but present, as though each spoonful was something he was deciding to receive rather than simply consuming. She sat across from him with her coffee, reheated a third time now, barely worth the bother, and said nothing for a while. The fire in the hearth had been built back up, and the kitchen was the warmest room in the house, the way it always was in winter, the center of everything. "How long have you been on the road?" she asked. He considered the question like it deserved consideration. "A while." "Weeks? Months?" "Closer to months." "Working?" "When there's work to be had." He looked up at her briefly. "I know what you're thinking." "I doubt that," she said. "You're thinking I'm running from something." "I'm thinking that's your business," Mara said. "I've got my own things I'm not explaining to strangers. I don't expect you to explain yours." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but an adjustment. Like she'd said something that didn't fit the shape of what he'd prepared for. "The fence on your east side is down," he said after a moment. She looked at him. "I know. The posts are rotted through at the base. It'll need new posts, not just wire." "I know that too." "I could fix it," he said, "before I move on, in exchange for a few days' food and the barn." Mara was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup slowly in both hands. Outside, the wind drove a sheet of snow against the window with a sound like thrown gravel. "You know fence work?" she said. "I know ranch work." She looked at him. Really looked at him. Not for threat, not for deception, but the way she'd learned to look at things on this land, with the practical eye of someone who had to make a decision about utility and trust simultaneously and get it right. "There's 3 cords of wood that need splitting," she said. "The hayloft door hinge is broken and the loft gets iced over without it closed. The water trough heater in the near pasture is throwing a fault code I can't diagnose." "All of that's manageable," he said. "You'd be sleeping in the barn. That's fine. My children are here, if you give me one single reason." "I understand," he said, and there was nothing defensive in it, nothing agitated. Just a simple acknowledgement that the boundary existed and he intended to honor it. She stood and went to the cabinet beside the sink and retrieved an extra blanket, the old wool one she kept there for when the propane heater struggled, and set it on the table beside his now empty bowl. "Barn's 40 feet past the back porch. There's a light switch just inside the door on your left. The loft is warmer than the floor." He stood, picked up the blanket, and nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Calloway." "Mara," she said. He paused at that. "Thank you, Mara." And then he walked through her back door and out into the dark and the cold, and she stood at the window and watched the light in the barn come on, that small rectangle of yellow cutting through the black, and told herself she wasn't watching to see if he'd done something wrong. She was watching because she hadn't seen that light on in the barn at night in 4 years, and it looked, against all reason, like something she'd been missing without knowing she'd lost it. He was already working when dawn broke. Mara had risen at 5:30, as she always did, pulled on her layers in the dark, started the coffee, and looked out the window toward the barn with what she told herself was purely practical concern. The light was still on. When she pulled on her coat and boots and crossed the yard in the blue-gray pre-dawn, she found the first cord of split wood already stacked against the barn wall. He was at the second cord, a steady rhythm, set, swing, split, set, working with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that effort spent on unnecessary speed was effort wasted. He didn't look up when she approached. He finished the piece he was splitting, set the halves aside, and then looked over. "Morning," he said. "How long have you been up?" "Since 3. "Why?" A pause. "I don't sleep much." She looked at the stacked wood, then back at him. "Coffee's on." He shook his head. "I'll finish this first." She stood there a moment longer. Frost Creek did not produce many men who turned down coffee to finish their work. Most of the men she'd dealt with in the last 6 years had been the other kind, the kind who talked about what needed doing while someone else did it. She went back inside and made breakfast for 4 instead of 3. Over the days that followed, Frost Creek went about its business and remained unaware that something had quietly shifted on the Callaway Ranch. Silas Mercer worked. That was the simplest and most complete description of him. He worked with a methodical focus that absorbed whatever the ranch placed in front of him, without complaint, without drama, and without needing to be told twice. The east fence posts were out and reset by the second day. The hayloft door was rehung by the third, swinging true and latching clean for the first time in what Mara estimated was 2 seasons. He diagnosed the trough heater fault, a sensor frozen in the wrong position, in under an hour and sourced a replacement part from the hardware store in town, paying for it from his own pocket before she could argue, and then refusing to be reimbursed with a quiet stubbornness that annoyed and impressed her in equal measure. He was careful with the children, deliberately careful, in the way of someone who understood they were not his children and intended to behave accordingly. He did not seek them out. He did not perform warmth. He was simply present in the spaces where their lives intersected. And when they came to him, Rosie first, inevitably, because Rosie approached everything and everyone with the undiscriminating openness of a creature who had not yet learned how the world disappointed you, he responded with a directness and honesty that Mara found unexpectedly moving. "What's that?" Rosie had asked on the third morning, pointing at the wrap around his left hand where he'd caught a piece of wire wrong on the fence work. "Cut," he said. "Does it hurt?" "Yes." "You should put a bandage on it." "I did." Rosie considered this. "My dad got a cut once and he put a bandage on it, and then it was fine." A silence, brief and careful. "That sounds like a smart man," Silas said. "He was," Rosie said, with the pure simplicity of a child who had not yet learned to make grief complicated. "He died. But he was really smart." Another silence. Longer. "I'm sorry," Silas said. "It's okay," Rosie said. "Mom says he's in the mountains somewhere." She tilted her head toward the distant beartooths visible through the barn door. "I think maybe he's the tall one." Mara, who had heard this from just inside the tack room, pressed her back against the wall and stayed very still and did not make a sound. She heard Silas say quietly, "That sounds about right to me." Clara was harder. Clara had been 10 when Tom died, old enough to carry a full understanding of the loss, old enough to have watched her mother rebuild something from rubble with her bare hands, old enough to know exactly how precarious everything still was. At 14, she wore her wariness like armor she'd learned to sleep in. She didn't trust easily, and she didn't trust men who showed up in winter asking for the barn. She made this known not through hostility, but through a studied, polite distance that was somehow more effective than open suspicion. She answered Silas's questions with the minimum necessary words. She didn't linger in rooms where he was present. She watched him with the careful, continuous attention of someone keeping an accurate record. "Clara," Mara said one evening, after the younger two were in bed and Clara sat at the kitchen table pretending to read while Silas sat on the porch in the cold, for his evening hour of solitude that had become, Mara noticed, a nightly pattern. "He's sad," Clara said, without looking up from her book. Mara paused. "What?" "He's sad." Clara finally looked up. "Not like regular sad, like how the barn looked after that winter 2 years ago, like something structural went wrong." Mara regarded her daughter for a long moment. "When did you get so observant?" "I live with you," Clara said. "I learned from the best." Mara sat down across from her. Outside, through the glass of the back door, she could see the shape of Silas on the porch bench, still looking north, the way he always looked when he thought no one was watching. "He's helping us," Mara said. "Whatever he's carrying, he's been nothing but decent." "I know," Clara said. "I'm not saying he isn't." She paused. "I'm saying be careful, not of him, just," she struggled for the word, "just of whatever it is you're starting to feel." The room was very quiet. "Go to bed, Clara," Mara said softly. Clara closed her book, stood, and kissed her mother on the cheek, something she rarely did, the gesture arriving like punctuation on a sentence that needed it. After she was gone, Mara sat alone in the kitchen for a long time, with the cold pressing at the windows and the fire settling in the hearth, and tried to tell herself that her 14-year-old daughter was wrong. She wasn't very convincing. Eli came to Silas on a Tuesday. Mara saw it from the kitchen window. Eli crossing the yard in his coat and boots, heading for the barn, where Silas was re-tarping the hay supply against a coming storm. She almost went out. She stopped herself. She watched instead. She couldn't hear what they said from this distance. She could only see the boy standing at the barn door with his particular careful posture, the man crouching down to Eli's level with a naturalness that had nothing performative in it. The conversation between them that lasted perhaps 10 minutes, during which Eli's body slowly lost a certain tension it had been holding. When Eli came back inside, he went directly upstairs without commentary. At dinner, he said, "Silas says the second heifer is going to drop before Christmas." "She might," Mara agreed. "He says he can help when it happens, if you need it." A pause. "He knows cattle." Mara looked at her son. "Did he tell you anything else?" Eli considered this with that careful precision of his. "He said work is the best way to stop thinking about things you can't change." Another pause. "I think maybe he was talking about himself, not me, but it still made sense." Mara was quiet for a moment. "It does make sense." Eli picked up his spoon. "He's okay, Mom." Mara looked at her son, 9 years old and already building his own reading of the world, already running his own calculations, already deciding what he was willing to trust, and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Like maybe, just maybe, the arithmetic was starting to work in their favor. Outside, the snow fell steadily, and the barn light was on, and somewhere in the distance, the Beartooth Mountains held their enormous silence, and a ranch that had been running on one person's will alone felt, for the first time in 6 years, like it had something extra in reserve. She didn't know yet what it was going to cost her. She didn't know that the stranger in her barn was not a stranger to this land at all. She didn't know that the warmth finding its way back into the cold bones of Frost Creek was moving toward a collision that would shatter everything she'd just begun to let herself believe. Not yet. For now, there was dinner on the table, wood stacked against the wall, and 3 children in chairs they'd had their whole lives, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, the silence in the house was not heavy. It was just quiet. And quiet, Mara Calloway was slowly remembering, could be something other than empty. December arrived the way it always did in the high country, not as a transition, but as a verdict. The temperature dropped another 12 degrees the first week of the month, and the ranch became a different kind of organism in response, tightening inward, conserving everything. The cattle moved slower, the pipes groaned at night, the windows frosted from the inside, and every morning Mara ran a dry cloth along the sills before the children woke so they wouldn't see how bad it had gotten. Silas had been at Frost Creek for 3 weeks now. The arrangement had shifted so gradually that Mara couldn't identify the exact moment it stopped feeling provisional. He had moved from the loft to the small room off the back of the barn, the one Tom had used as a tack and repair space, barely large enough for a cot and a wood stove, but weatherproofed in a way the loft was not. Mara had offered it without making an event of it. Silas had accepted without making an event of it. That was the particular rhythm they had found. Nothing announced, nothing dramatized, just the quiet agreement of two people who understood that survival required a certain practical unself-consciousness. He earned his place every single day. The second heifer calved on a Thursday night, earlier than expected and harder than hoped. Mara had been up since midnight, checking on her every hour, and when the labor stalled at 2 a.m. and the heifer's distress became something more urgent than patience could address, it was Silas who was already in the barn doorway before she'd had time to decide whether to knock on his door. He hadn't been sleeping. She was beginning to understand that he rarely did. They worked together in the cold and the straw and the particular focused silence of people managing something that required all their attention, and when the calf finally came, slipping into the world with that startling sudden rush that never stopped feeling like a small miracle regardless of how many times you'd witnessed it, Mara sat back on her heels in the straw and exhaled for what felt like the first time in an hour. "There," Silas said quietly. He was already moving, clearing the calf's airway with quick, certain hands. "You've done this before," Mara said. It wasn't a question. "More times than I can count," he said. He didn't look up. She watched his hands, careful, unhesitating, and filed the observation away with the others she'd been accumulating. The way he read the weather by things she hadn't noticed, she'd stopped noticing. The way he moved through the ranch, not like a man learning it, but like a man remembering it. The way he sometimes stopped in certain places and stood very still for a moment before continuing on, as though the ground itself had said something to him. She had questions she hadn't asked yet. She was beginning to wonder how much longer she could afford not to ask them. The calf was on its feet within the hour, wobbling and indignant, and Mara named her December without meaning to, just said the word aloud while watching her find her legs, and Rosie, who had appeared in the barn door in her nightgown and boots, despite being specifically told to stay inside, announced that it was the best name she had ever heard, and that was that. "You're going to freeze in that nightgown," Silas told her, not unkindly. "I'm not cold," Rosie said, which was obviously untrue given the visible shaking. "Back inside," Mara said. "Can I come back in the morning?" "Yes." "Promise?" "Rosie." She went, but slowly, turning back twice to look at the calf with an expression of absolute wonder that made the cold and the hour and the exhaustion briefly irrelevant. When she was gone, the barn was quiet again. Just the animals settling and the wind against the wood and the new calf's small sounds. Mara stayed in the straw a moment longer than she needed to. "Thank you," she said. "It's what I'm here for," Silas said. She almost let it go. Almost. "Is it?" she said. "Because I'm still not entirely sure why you're here, or where you were before, or where North actually is." He was quiet for a beat. He set down the cloth he'd been using and turned to look at her directly. That gray-eyed directness that she'd come to associate with the moments when he chose honesty over deflection. "I'm here because you opened your door," he said. "The rest is—" A pause. "The rest isn't a simple answer." "I'm not asking for simple," Mara said. "I'm asking for true." He held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not avoidance, but weight. The weight of a person deciding how much of themselves they are willing to give away in a single night. "Not tonight," he said quietly. "I'm not ready." It was such a plain, undefended thing to say. Not a deflection dressed in confidence, but an honest admission of unreadiness, that she found she couldn't push against it. "All right," she said. She stood, brushed the straw from her jeans. Then not tonight. She walked back to the house alone, and the light in the small room off the barn stayed on until nearly dawn. The talk started in town the second week of December. Mara heard it first from Janet Pruitt at the feed store, delivered with the particular gentleness of someone who considers themselves to be doing you a favor by informing you of damage already done. "People are talking, Mara." Janet set the bag of mineral supplement on the counter and kept her voice pitched low, as though proximity were the issue rather than the content. "About the man staying at your place." "He's a hand," Mara said. "He works for room and board." "I know that. I'm just telling you what people are saying. This is a small town. I'm aware of that." Doris Fenner told Ruth Mackey that she'd seen a man's truck parked at your gate 2 mornings running, and Ruth told, "That truck is mine," Mara said. "He doesn't have a truck." Janet blinked. "Oh. Is there anything else I need to know about what I'm doing on my own property?" The gentleness in Janet's expression shifted to something more complicated. Not quite embarrassment, not quite defensiveness. I'm on your side, Mara. I just don't want you to get... I just want things to go well for you. People talk. You know how they are? I know exactly how they are, Mara said. She picked up the supplement and her receipt. Thank you for the heads up, Janet. She drove back to the ranch with both hands tight on the wheel and the heater blowing full, and the particular controlled anger of a woman who had been managing other people's opinions of her life for 6 years and was deeply tired of it. She knew what they saw. A widow. Vulnerable by definition in the eyes of a town that sorted people by category. She had been fighting that categorization since the day Tom was buried, fighting it through every repaired fence and every paid bill, and every morning she got up and did it again, and it never seemed to matter. The category remained. The expectation of failure remained. And now, apparently, a hired hand in her barn was enough to give the gossip a new direction to run. What she didn't expect was Vern Rucker. He came to the ranch on a Friday afternoon in his truck with the extended cab and the clean tires that had never seen mud, because Vern Rucker was the kind of man whose trucks stayed clean because other people drove them through the mud. He came alone, which meant he wasn't there for intimidation, or at least not the overt kind. He knocked on the front door. Silas was at the north fence line. The children were home from school. Mara stepped onto the porch and pulled the door half closed behind her, and did not invite Vern Rucker inside. He was a large man in his late 50s, with the healthy, well-fed solidity of someone for whom money had always been a given rather than a goal. He had a pleasant face when he wanted to, broad and ruddy, with the kind of confidence that read as warmth until you realized it was actually just certainty. Mara, he said, with the particular warmth of a man who believes being on a first-name basis with someone confers a relationship that doesn't actually exist. Mr. Rucker, she said. The slight adjustment in his expression was almost imperceptible. Almost. I heard you've taken on a hired man. I have. Work getting ahead of you? Just smart management, she said. Delegation, I believe that's what it's called in your circles. Rucker's smile stayed in place with the practiced ease of a man who had absorbed many small challenges and learned never to let them show. I'm not here to cause trouble, Mara. I'm here because I genuinely believe my offer is the best thing for you and those kids. 210 acres up here trying to run cattle through these winters. He shook his head with what was designed to look like concern. It's an enormous burden for one person. I'm not one person anymore, she said, and this property is not for sale. The offer won't stay at this number. That implies I care about the number. Everyone cares about the number eventually, Rucker said, especially when the bank gets involved. Mara looked at him steadily. If you have information about my mortgage that you shouldn't have, that's a conversation for my lawyer. If you're guessing, then you're guessing. Either way, you're done here. She held the porch for a long moment after he got back in his truck. She held it until the truck had gone back down the access road and turned onto the county highway and disappeared. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and pressed both hands flat against the wood surface and breathed. Clara came in from the living room. She took one look at her mother and went to the stove and started heating water without being asked, because Clara Calloway had her father's instinct for the right response to a moment that didn't need words. Mara watched her eldest daughter move through the kitchen with that quiet, practiced competence and thought, she is 14 years old. She should not have to be this steady. The thought had an edge to it. Not guilt exactly, but something close. The particular grief of knowing that hardship had made your children capable in ways that childhood shouldn't require. Rucker? Clara asked, setting the cup down. Rucker, Mara confirmed. Clara sat down across from her. He's not going to stop. No. So what do we do? Mara wrapped her hands around the cup. We keep doing what we're doing. We don't give him anything to take. Clara was quiet for a moment, then, Silas knows something's wrong. He saw the truck from the fence line. Mara looked up. He didn't say anything, Clara added quickly. I saw him watching when Rucker was leaving. A pause. He looked like he recognized him. Mara held that thought for a moment, filed it with the others. Let it be, she said finally. Clara nodded. But her eyes held the reservation of someone who wasn't sure letting it be was the same as letting it go. It was Eli who actually asked, That Saturday, with the temperature finally climbed to something manageable and a pale winter sun making the snow surface glitter like scattered glass, Eli found Silas in the equipment shed running a diagnostic on the tractor's hydraulic line. He stood in the shed door for a moment with the particular patience of a boy who had learned that waiting for the right moment was more effective than demanding one. Silas looked over. "Hand me that wrench, the one with the blue handle." Eli found it and brought it over and crouched down beside him, because that was what you did when someone was working on something. You didn't stand over them, you got level. They worked together in silence for a while. Or rather, Silas worked, and Eli assisted, passing tools with a focused attentiveness that Silas had noticed and quietly respected since the first week. "Do you know Mr. Rucker?" Eli asked. No preamble, just the question, flat and careful. Silas's hands didn't stop moving. "Why?" "Clara said you watched his truck leave the other day, like you knew who it was." A pause. The hydraulic line connector made a small click as it seated correctly. "I know of him," Silas said, "by reputation." "What kind of reputation?" "The kind where what's his and what he wants to be his tend to get confused in his mind." Eli considered this. "He wants our ranch." "I know. He's been wanting it for 2 years. Mom says he keeps making offers." Another pause. "She keeps saying no." "Good," Silas said. "She's not going to sell," Eli said. There was something in his voice beneath the statement. Not quite a question, but not entirely not one either. The particular uncertainty of a child who believes something is true, but has lived long enough to know that believing something is true doesn't make it permanent. Silas set the wrench down and looked at the boy directly. "No," he said. "She's not." "How do you know?" "Because I've seen what it takes to hold something this long, and your mother has it, whatever it is. She has it." Eli was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "My dad had it too," he said, "before he died." Silas didn't look away from the boy's face. "Tell me about him." It was the right thing to say. Eli didn't talk about Tom the way Rosie did, easily, openly, without self-consciousness. Eli carried his father the way he carried most important things, close to the chest and carefully protected. But he talked now, haltingly at first, and then with increasing steadiness, about a man who could read the weather 3 days out by watching the way the cattle moved, who could fix any engine given enough time and enough quiet, who used to take Eli up to the North Ridge on Saturday mornings when the work allowed it and just sit there with him saying nothing, because sometimes saying nothing with someone was the whole point. Silas listened. He didn't offer commentary or comparison. He just listened, with the full, undivided attention of a person who understood that being heard was its own form of repair. When Eli finished, the shed was quiet except for the wind outside. "He sounds like he was worth knowing," Silas said. "Yeah," Eli said. "He was." They went back to the hydraulic line after that. But something had shifted between them. Not dramatically, not irreversibly, but in the small, definitive way that mattered most. What Mara noticed, as December deepened, was the way her body had begun to unlench. It was such a specific and unfamiliar sensation that it took her a while to identify it. She had been running at maximum tension for so long that relaxation had become a foreign country. But something in the daily texture of the ranch had changed, and the change was registered not in her mind first, but in her muscles, in the loosening of her shoulders by evening, in the fact that she was sleeping 4 unbroken hours instead of 2, in the way she sometimes stood at the kitchen window in the early morning without running calculations for 5 or 10 consecutive minutes. It was dangerous, she told herself. Dependence on a situation you don't control is a form of debt. She told herself that. She continued to notice the unlenching anyway. Silas was at the table one evening after the children were in bed, the two of them doing what had become an unannounced routine, she with her account books, he doing whatever repair work could be done indoors by lamplight, which turned out to be quite a lot. There was a companionable silence between them that she had stopped analyzing and simply accepted, the way you accept the warmth of a fire without needing to understand combustion. "Rucker has a partner," Silas said, without looking up from the harness buckle he was resolving. "A lawyer out of Billings named Croft. They've done this before. Identified properties with single owners, applied financial pressure, bought at auction when the mortgage calls." Mara looked up from her accounts. "How do you know that?" A pause. The buckle received his full attention for a moment longer than it required. I pay attention to things that happen to be relevant to this ranch specifically. He set the harness down and looked at her. Yes. Silas. Mara. That's not an answer. He was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to have weight. Then, no, it isn't. He picked up the harness again. Rucker's move will come in the spring if he can find a pressure point. Your mortgage is current, so he needs a different angle. He'll look for one. And you know this because I know this kind of man. He said it with a quietness that was absolute, the quietness of someone speaking from a place so far past opinion that it had become simple knowledge. She studied him in the lamplight. The beard had been trimmed in the past week. She'd noticed, hadn't commented. The lines around his eyes were the same, but there was something slightly different in the set of his face these days. Less like a man walking through his own wreckage, more like a man who had stopped, looked around, and found something worth looking at. You should sleep, she said finally. You should too. I will when the accounts balance. They won't tonight. He said it without cruelty, just with the accuracy of someone who had looked at the numbers when she wasn't watching. You're short on the February payment regardless of what you move around, but not by an amount that can't be closed. You need one decent month. Mara set her pen down. You looked at my books. The page was open. That was not an invitation. No, he agreed. It wasn't. And I'm sorry. He met her eyes. I couldn't help it. It's the kind of problem I see and can't look away from. She wanted to be angry. She arranged the components of the reaction, the invasion of privacy, the presumption, and found that somewhere in the assembly, the anger lost its shape. You know ranch accounting, she said, among other things. Among what other things, Silas? The lamplight moved slightly as a draft found the gap under the back door. His shadow shifted on the wall behind him. More than I've told you, he said quietly. And I know that's not fair. She looked at him for a long time. Outside, the wind had dropped to almost nothing, and in the hush she could hear the cattle moving in the near pasture and the tick of the cooling stovepipe, and the particular quality of silence that a ranch had late at night, which was different from any other silence she'd known. When you're ready, she said. Whatever the rest of it is. When you're ready. She gathered her account books and went to bed, and she lay in the dark and listened to the ranch settle around her, and thought about a man who paid attention to things that happened to be relevant to a specific piece of land, and the thought was not as comfortable as she wanted it to be. But comfort, Mara Calloway had long since decided, was not the point. The point was true. The point, and somewhere between the account books and the lamplight, and the quiet that wasn't empty anymore, she was becoming very afraid that when the truth finally arrived, it was going to cost her something she'd only just begun to reclaim. She was right. She just didn't know yet how completely right she was. The truth had been there all along, patient as the mountains. It came on a Tuesday in late January, the way the worst things always seem to. Not announced, not dramatic in its approach, just suddenly present in a way that made you understand it had been moving toward you for a long time, and you had simply failed to see it coming. Mara had driven into Billings for supplies and to meet with her bank contact about the February payment, a conversation she had been steeling herself for since December. She left Silas with the children, which was itself something she had not paused to examine. The fact that leaving Silas with the children had become a thing she did without the particular knot of reservation that had accompanied every other arrangement she'd made in 6 years. She had stopped pausing to examine a great many things. She would later identify this as the moment she'd let her guard down, not because of Silas specifically, but because of what he'd given the ranch, which was the dangerous luxury of feeling like maybe things were going to be all right. The meeting at the bank was not catastrophic. It was not good either. What it was a very clear articulation of what she already knew, that the February payment would stretch her to the absolute limit of what was manageable, that one more unexpected expense before spring would constitute a genuine crisis, and that the margin between holding on and losing everything had not gotten any wider, despite 6 years of effort. She drove home in the late afternoon with the particular grim clarity of someone who has looked at a problem in full light and found it exactly as large as they feared. She stopped at the county records office because she needed to pull the boundary survey for the north pasture. There had been a question about the fence line Silas had identified. a potential encroachment issue that needed documentation before it became a legal problem. The clerk was a young man she didn't know well, efficient and pleasant, and he pulled the relevant file within minutes. He set it on the counter. Mara looked at it, and then she looked at it again. The property survey was correct. The boundary lines were where she expected them to be. The acreage matched. All of that was fine. What was not fine was the ownership section. The section she had never had reason to examine closely because she had been operating under the assumption that the property had transferred cleanly to Tom when he purchased it 14 years ago, and from Tom to her estate after his death, and had been hers in every legal and practical sense since. The name on the deed was not Tom Calloway. It was not Mara Calloway. The name on the deed was Silas James Mercer. She drove home. She did not know how. She would later have no memory of the 40-minute drive, no memory of parking, no memory of walking from the truck to the house. What she remembered was the kitchen. Standing in the kitchen with the copied survey document in her hand and the cold coming off her coat in waves, and the sound of Rosie's voice somewhere upstairs, and the particular quality of the afternoon light coming through the window above the sink. Silas was in the barn. She could see the light on from here. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. Long enough for the cold to leave her coat, long enough for the light outside to shift from afternoon to early evening, long enough for the thing she was feeling, which was not a single thing but a compound of things that hadn't fully sorted themselves yet, to settle into something she could move through. She went to the barn. He was at the workbench with his back to her, cleaning the bit assemblies from the bridles she'd asked him to check for corrosion. He heard her come in. She knew he heard her. He always heard everything. But he didn't turn immediately, finishing the piece in his hand before he set it down and turned around. He saw her face. Whatever he had been prepared for in any given moment of any given day, it was clear from the way his expression changed that he had not been prepared for what he saw in her face right now. She held up the survey document. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever stood inside. "When?" she said. Her voice was even. She had spent too many years maintaining evenness under pressure to lose it now. "When were you going to tell me?" He didn't ask what she was holding. He didn't look confused. He looked like a man watching something he had been both dreading and expecting finally arrive. "Mara?" "When?" she said again. Still even. The evenness was a wall, and behind it was something she was not ready to release in a barn. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't know." "You don't know." "I hadn't decided." "You hadn't decided." She lowered the document. "How long have you been deciding, Silas? Because this deed is 14 years old. This is your name. This is your land." Her voice fractured slightly on the last word, and she pulled it back. "This land that I have been working for 6 years, that Tom paid for, that my children grew up on. Tom didn't—" He stopped himself. Something cold moved through her. Tom didn't what? He pressed both hands flat on the workbench behind him, not defensively, but like someone bracing against something they knew was going to cost them. "Tom leased the property. From me. The arrangement was, it was a private lease long-term with an option to purchase. He was working toward buying it outright." A pause. "He died before the purchase completed. The kitchen had been warm. The barn was not warm." Mara became aware of the cold in a distant, peripheral way, the way you became aware of background sounds during a moment of shock. "He leased it," she said. "Yes." "And you left after—" She looked at him, really looked at him, with everything she now knew and everything she was now reconstructing. "The fire. That's why you left." Something crossed his face that she had no name for. Not guilt, not grief, but a combination of those and something older than both of them that lived underneath. "My wife," he said quietly. "And my son." He stopped, started again. "They were in the house when it went. I was at the east fence. I saw the smoke and I ran and it was—" He stopped again. His jaw worked for a moment. "It was done before I could do anything. It was already done." The barn was very still. Outside, one of the cattle shifted, and the sound of it was ordinary and absurd against the weight of what was in the room. "I left," he said. "I know how that sounds. I know what it makes me. But I left because I could not—" He shook his head. I couldn't be on this land and be what I had been. I couldn't breathe here. I signed over operational authority to a property management contact in Billings, and I walked away and I didn't look back. You walked away, Mara said, and Tom moved his family here and paid his lease, and then he died too, and I kept paying. Who did I keep paying? Who has been taking my checks? A management trust account. It goes into an account I haven't accessed in 4 years. He met her eyes. I never spent it. Not a cent of it. That's not... She stopped. That's not the point. The point is that I did not know. Every fence post and every mortgage payment, and every night I sat at that table and wondered whether I was going to lose this place. I did not know that the person who could take it from me was sleeping in my barn. She heard her own voice on that last sentence. She heard what was in it, underneath the anger. She heard the thing she had been moving toward for weeks, the thing Clara had seen and warned her about, the thing she had been telling herself was just gratitude and practicality and the simple warmth of another adult in the house. From the way Silas looked at her, he heard it too. I came back to sell, he said. The honesty of it was brutal, and she respected the brutality. I came back because I needed to close it. The deed, the account, all of it. I needed to sever the last connection to what this place was. His voice dropped. I didn't know anyone was here. The management contact had stopped sending reports, and I assumed the lease had lapsed. But you found us here, you found me here, and you didn't say anything. No. Why? The single word landed in the barn and neither of them moved for a long moment. Because the first night I walked into your kitchen and sat at that table, he said slowly, I felt something I had not felt in 5 years, and I didn't know what to do with it. And then every day after that, he exhaled. Every day after that made leaving harder and telling you harder in a different way. And I kept thinking I would find the right moment, and the right moment kept not being the one I was in. There is no right moment for this, Mara said. I know that now. You knew it then. Yes. A pause. I did. The anger was still there. It was not going anywhere. But underneath it, something else had arrived, something she had not anticipated, which was the particular sorrow of understanding a person too well to hate them cleanly. She could see exactly how it had happened. The exhausted, hollowed man arriving at a stranger's door. The warmth of the kitchen, the children, the grinding daily work that had a way of creating its own kind of belonging. She could see the sequence of every choice that had led to this barn, this moment, this devastating gap between what she thought she was building and what was actually true. Seeing it didn't make it hurt less. It just made it more complicated. Get out of my barn, she said. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He picked up his coat from the hook and walked past her to the barn door and stopped with his hand on it. Mara, I can't talk to you right now. I know. He stood there for one more second. The deed, whatever I do with it, whatever happens, I need you to know that what I did here, the work, the time with your kids, he stopped. That was real. That was the most real thing I've done in 5 years. She didn't answer. He walked out into the dark. She told Clara that night. Not everything. Not the full architecture of it, not the ownership, not the deed, but enough. She told Clara that Silas had a prior connection to the property that he hadn't disclosed, and that she needed some distance to think about what it meant. She was not entirely sure why she told Clara instead of simply carrying it alone the way she carried everything else. Clara listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Mara finished, her daughter was quiet for a long moment. Is he dangerous? Clara asked. The question was practical, not fearful. Classic Clara. No, Mara said, and realized she meant it without reservation. Whatever else he was, whatever he had withheld, she had no fear of Silas Mercer. The absence of that fear was its own complicated thing. What are you going to do? I don't know yet. Clara nodded slowly. Eli's going to ask where he is in the morning. I'll handle it. Rosie's going to cry. Mara pressed her fingers against her eyes. I know. Mom? Clara's voice was careful, threading the needle between her mother and something she'd been holding for a while. You're not wrong to be angry, but... She paused. He didn't have to fix the fence. He didn't have to stay up with the heifer. He didn't have to... She stopped herself. I'm just saying, whatever the rest of it is. The part where he was here. That part was real. Mara looked at her daughter, 14 years old, eyes that had seen too much and somehow remained clear. He said the same thing, Mara said softly. Clara said nothing. She went to bed. Mara sat alone at the kitchen table with the survey document and the account books and the weight of what she knew. He came back in the morning, not to the house, to the barn, to the work, arriving at the same hour he always had, because the cattle needed feeding regardless of what had happened the night before, and he apparently understood that at a level that bypassed whatever was between them. Mara watched him from the kitchen window and felt the anger and the complication of the anger and didn't go out. It was Eli who told her 3 days later. He came in from doing the afternoon check on the near pasture animals, with the particular expression of a boy carrying information he wasn't sure whether to deliver. Silas got a phone call, he said carefully. Mara looked up from the stove. What do you mean? I was near the barn. I heard him talking. His phone. Eli's jaw worked slightly. He was telling someone to postpone something. An auction. The word landed on Mara like a physical thing. An auction, she repeated. He said, Eli was clearly replaying the words carefully. He said, postpone the filing. I need more time. And then he said, I'm aware of the legal position. Just do it. Mara turned off the burner. Mom? Thank you, Eli. Is he going to sell? Eli's voice had something in it she rarely heard. Not quite fear, but its immediate neighbor. The voice of a child who has learned not to assume safety. She crossed the kitchen and crouched down to his level, the way Silas had done with him in the barn months ago, and she looked at her son directly. I don't know, she said, because she had made a rule long ago about not lying to her children when the truth was something they deserved. But I'm going to find out. She found him at the east fence, the same east fence he had reset in December, the posts he'd sunk himself in the frozen ground. He was checking the wire tension, working his way along the line with the methodical focus she had come to know as his native state, the focus of a man who treated work as something close to prayer. He heard her coming. He turned. You called to postpone the auction, she said. No preamble, no softening. She was done with both. He didn't deny it. Yes. How long have you had it scheduled? I filed the paperwork before I came here. He set the fence tool down on the snow-covered post. It was the reason I came north. The auction was set for the spring. The property, the deed, the account, all of it cleared and sold. That was the plan. And now? He looked at her across the fence line, and the space between them was a single wire's width and about 10,000 miles. I don't know what now is, he said. I've been trying to figure that out since December. Let me tell you what I know, Mara said, and her voice was low and clear and carried no performance in it whatsoever. I know that I have 3 children who need this land. I know that I have put 6 years of myself into this place. I know that Tom put everything he had into building a home here for his family, and that his children are still living in it, and that it matters. She paused. I know that you can sell this land. I know that legally there is nothing I can do to stop you. And I know that if you do, Rucker will have it within the year and everything on it will be gone. Silas was very still. So I'm asking you, Mara said. Not as someone who has a legal claim because I've looked at what I have and I know what I don't have. I'm asking you as the person who opened her door in a blizzard and fed you beans and gave you a place in the barn. Her voice stayed steady, but something in it shifted, something she'd been holding back since the night in the barn when she'd told him to leave and then stood in her kitchen and understood exactly what she was losing. Whatever brought you here, whatever you thought you were going to do, look at this place. Look at what's here, and then tell me you can walk away from it again. The wind moved across the field between them. Silas stood with the weight of everything he'd lost and everything he'd found in the same body, in the same moment, on the same piece of ground that had already broken him once. He looked at the fence he'd built, at the mountains beyond, at this woman standing in the snow telling him the truth about what his choice would cost. Not hysterically, not manipulatively, but with the plain, unstaggering courage of someone who had nothing left to hide behind. He picked up the fence tool. He turned back to the wire. Go inside, Mara, he said. It's cold. Silas, I heard you, he said quietly. I heard every word. She stood at the fence line for a moment longer. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, and she did not look back. because some decisions required the space of being alone to become real, and she understood that better than most. Behind her, the fence line stretched east toward the tree line, straight and solid in the winter ground, built to hold against whatever came, posts sunk deep, wire drawn true, the work of a man who had come to take something and stayed to protect it instead. Whether he knew that yet or not was a question only he could answer, and the answer was coming. She could feel it in the same way she felt weather change on this land. Not by looking at it directly, but by the way everything around her had gone very quiet, holding its breath, waiting for something that was going to be either a storm or a clearing. Either way, Frost Creek would not look the same on the other side of it. 3 days passed in a silence that had texture to it. Not the comfortable silence that had settled between them over weeks of shared mornings and evening lamplight. This was something different, something with edges, a silence that both of them moved carefully around the way you moved around a wound that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to heal or go septic. Silas was at the ranch. He worked. The cattle were fed and the fences held and the machinery ran, and every morning Mara looked out the kitchen window and saw the barn light on before dawn and understood that whatever decision was forming inside him, it had not finished forming yet. She did not push. She had said what she had to say at the fence line, and anything beyond that would be pressure rather than truth, and she had too much respect for both of them to cross that line. The children navigated the shift in atmosphere with the particular sensitivity of young people who have learned to read adult weather. Rosie alone seemed impervious, chattering at Silas over breakfast with the relentless goodwill of a creature who had decided he was family and saw no reason to revisit the decision. Eli was watchful. Clara was quiet in a way that meant she was processing rather than withdrawing, a distinction Mara had learned to recognize. It was on the fourth morning that everything collapsed at once. Mara heard the truck before she saw it, a sound different from Rucker's vehicle, smaller engine, faster approach. The particular urgency of someone who had decided the visit couldn't wait. She was at the kitchen window when it came up the access road, and she recognized it before it stopped because she had been half expecting it for 2 years, in the way you half expect things you've been dreading, the anticipation of it a low-grade hum underneath everything else. The truck belonged to Gerald Calloway, Tom's older brother. Gerald was 3 years older than Tom had been, and he carried the family resemblance in a way that had always cost Mara something to look at. The same line of the jaw, the same way of holding his shoulders. But where Tom had been still at his center, Gerald was kinetic, restless, a man whose energy always seemed to be pushing towards something at the expense of whatever was directly in front of him. He had come to the funeral 6 years ago and stayed 4 days and said all the right things, and then had begun, quietly and persistently, to suggest that Mara and the children might be better off closer to family. Closer to him, specifically, in his house in Cheyenne, where he lived with his second wife and a life that had no particular room for 3 children but could be made to accommodate them if Mara would be reasonable about it. Mara had not been reasonable about it, in the particular way she was unreasonable about things that mattered. He climbed out of the truck and looked around the ranch yard with an expression she recognized, not admiring, not critical, but assessing, calculating. The expression of a man who had come to do something he'd already decided on. She went to the front door before he could knock. "Gerald," she said. "Mara." He had the particular warmth of a man who had prepared for a difficult conversation. "You look tired." "I'm fine. Why are you here?" He spread his hands slightly. "Can't I come and see my brother's family?" "You've been here twice in 6 years. One of those times was the funeral." She held the door frame. "Why are you here?" He dropped the warmth the way a man drops a tool he's realized isn't working. "I've been in contact with an attorney about the children." The words hit her in the chest with a cold, clean impact. "About the children," she repeated. "Mara, listen to me. I know you've been doing your best. I know that. But the situation here," he glanced toward the barn, toward the equipment, toward the evidence of a ranch running on minimum margin. "I've had people looking into things. The mortgage situation, the land complications." "What land complications?" she said very quietly. He looked at her steadily. "I know about the deed, Mara." She went still. "I have a contact at the county records office," Gerald said. "I know that the property is not and has never been in your name. I know that the man you have living in your barn is the legal owner of this land, And I know that you have 3 children living on a property that can be taken from you legally without any recourse. He paused, and she could see him calibrating, deciding how hard to push. I have a stable home. Carol is prepared to receive them. The children would have consistency, security. Stop. The word came out of her like a flat, hard stone. You will stop right there. Mara, these are my children, Tom's children. They were born on this land, and they are going to stay on this land, and you will not come to my door and tell me what is stable and what is not when you have not been here. Her voice was even. She was shaking somewhere below the surface of it, and she would not let it reach the surface. Not for the fence repairs, not for the calving, not for the nights I sat alone at that table and balanced those books down to the last dollar. You were not here for any of it, Gerald, and you do not get to arrive now with an attorney and tell me what my children need. Gerald's jaw was tight. He was a man who had prepared for resistance, but perhaps not for this specific quality of resistance. Not hysterical, not tearful, just absolute. The legal situation is mine to manage. You don't have the resources to. That is not your determination to make. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her shoulder, and she didn't need to turn around to know that Silas was there. She'd heard him come out of the barn, heard his boots on the frozen ground, felt the shift in the air, the way you felt a change in atmospheric pressure. This the man? Gerald said. This is none of your business, Mara said. Silas came to stand beside her. Not in front of her, not between her and Gerald, but beside her, in the way of someone who understood the precise geometry of what was needed. You're Gerald Calloway, Silas said. Gerald looked at him with the assessment of a man trying to determine the nature of a variable he hadn't fully factored. And you're Silas Mercer. I am. Then you understand that whatever... I understand the legal position perfectly, Silas said. His voice was measured and unhurried, the voice of a man who had spent time in difficult conversations and knew that volume was almost never the point. You're considering a custody filing based on the instability of the housing situation. You have documentation of the deed discrepancy. Your attorney has probably told you it's viable. Gerald said nothing, which was its own answer. Here's what else is true, Silas said. These children have been raised on this land by their mother for 6 years with exactly 0 support from their father's family. Their mother has maintained this property, met her obligations, and built a life here that any reasonable court is going to recognize as a stable home by every meaningful measure. The deed situation is being resolved, and if you file, I will be a witness, in detail. You testify against your own legal interest? I testify to what I've seen, Silas said, which is a woman and 3 children who belong here. The wind moved between them. Somewhere behind the house, December, the calf made a sound that was both incongruous and perfectly timed. Gerald looked at Mara, then at Silas, then back at Mara, with something in his expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite retreat, but a recalculation. A man revising a plan he'd arrived confident in. This isn't over, he said finally. But it had the sound of something that might be over or might become over given sufficient information. Come back when you want to be family instead of an attorney, Mara said. My door will be open. She held the door frame until his truck had gone back down the access road. Then she let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, and she turned to look at Silas, and Silas looked back at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. You didn't have to come out here, she said. I know. He might use what you said against you, legally. I know that too. She looked at him for a long moment. Silas, I'm going to Billings, he said. Today. There are things that need to be done, and I've been deciding long enough. He paused. I want you to know that whatever comes out of it, the decisions I make down there, they're made because of what I believe is right. Not because of anything you said at the fence line. What did I say at the fence line? You told me to look at what's here. He held her gaze. I've been looking. For 2 months I've been looking at nothing else. She nodded slowly. She didn't ask what he was going to do. Some things had to be allowed to arrive in their own time. He drove to Billings that afternoon. He was gone for 2 days. They were 2 of the longer days Mara could remember, and she did not fully understand why until Rosie asked at dinner on the first night when Silas was coming back, and Mara said she wasn't sure, and Rosie accepted this with a 6-year-old's fundamental confidence that things came back if they were supposed to, and Mara sat with the simplicity of that confidence and found she could not fully share it. She worked. She kept the routine. She checked the cattle and managed the feeding and sat at the account books in the evening and did what she always did, which was keep moving because stopping had never been an option she allowed herself. But the barn light was off, and the absence of it, which should have been neutral, it was just a light, it was just electricity, it meant nothing, was not neutral. It was a specific located absence, the way certain silences were located in the particular shape of the person who used to fill them. She did not let herself think about what it meant if he didn't come back. She thought about it constantly. On the second night, Clara sat with her at the kitchen table without being asked, and did her homework in companionable silence while Mara worked the accounts. And at some point, Mara looked up and found her daughter watching her with that clear-eyed 14-year-old clarity that saw more than it was supposed to. "He's coming back," Clara said. "You don't know that." "I know that he fixed the east fence in frozen ground," Clara said. "Men who aren't staying don't sink fence posts in frozen ground." Mara looked at her daughter. "Also," Clara added, returning to her homework, "he left his good work gloves in the tack room. Nobody leaves their good gloves." Mara laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly, real and brief, and it surprised both of them. "When did you get so pragmatic?" Mara said. "Same time I got observant," Clara said. "Living with you." He came back on the third morning. He came back in his truck. She heard it before she saw it now, the way she'd learned the particular sound of it. And he parked in the yard and came to the front door and knocked, which he hadn't done since the very first night. He knocked because what he was carrying required the formality of a knock. She opened the door, and he stood on her porch with a folder of documents and the expression of a man who had done something irreversible and was entirely at peace with it. "Come in," she said. He sat at the kitchen table. She sat across from him. He put the folder on the table between them. "The auction has been canceled," he said, "permanently. The filing has been withdrawn and cannot be reinstated without a separate legal process that I have no intention of initiating." Mara looked at the folder. "I've had the property surveyed and the deed structure reviewed by an attorney in Billings," Silas continued. "What we're creating is a life estate arrangement. You and your children have the right to live on and operate this land for as long as you choose. That right is legally protected and cannot be overridden by any sale, transfer, or claim, including mine." She looked up at him. "The land remains in my name technically," he said, "because transferring it outright creates tax complications that would hurt you rather than help you. The attorney structured it so the practical ownership, the rights, the operation, the decision-making, is yours, fully. If you choose at any point to purchase it formally, I have set the price at the amount of back lease Tom paid before he died, which you have already paid through the trust account, which means," he paused, "which means it is effectively already yours." The kitchen was very quiet. "The mortgage," Mara said. "Settled." He said it without ceremony. "The February payment and the outstanding balance. It's done." She stood up from the table. She didn't know why she stood up. She just needed to be vertical, needed to be upright against the weight of what he was saying. "Silas, I had the money," he said, "in the trust account. Your payments over 6 years. I told you I never spent it." He looked at her steadily. "It was yours. It always should have been." She turned to the window. Outside, the ranch yard was bright with winter sun, everything white and defined and clear. The fence line, the barn, the far pasture where the cattle moved in their slow, purposeful way. 200 acres of Montana that she had fought for and bled for and refused to relinquish, that was now, in every way that mattered, hers. She heard the chair move behind her. She heard him stand. "I also went to see Sheriff Baines," Silas said, "and an attorney who specializes in family law. About Gerald." A pause. "He's been sent documentation that establishes the housing situation is legally stable and secure. His attorney has advised him, apparently, that a custody filing would not be well received by a court, given the circumstances." Another pause. "I also called Gerald directly." She turned around. "I told him that his brother would have expected better of him," Silas said quietly, "and that if he wanted to be part of his brother's children's lives, the door was open, but not through a courtroom." Mara looked at this man, this complicated, broken, quietly extraordinary man, standing in her kitchen in the winter light, and felt something shift in her chest that was so large and so long held that its movement was almost physical. "Why?" she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "Why did you do all of this?" He looked at her with those clear gray eyes, and what was in them was no longer the structural exhaustion she had seen on her porch that first November night. It was something else, something that had been slowly, stubbornly building itself out of the wreckage that he'd carried here, built from fence posts and evening lamplight, and a 6-year-old's questions, and a 9-year-old's careful words, and a 14-year-old's honest eyes, and a woman who opened her door in a blizzard because she was too stubborn and too decent to do otherwise. "You know why," he said. She did know. She had known for weeks. That was the thing about truth on this kind of land. You couldn't hide from it any more than you could hide from weather. It found you eventually, and then you had to decide what to do about it. "You could have sold it," she said. "You could have taken the money and gone north and never—" "I know. You had every legal right. I know that too. So why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the quality of something said for the first time after a long time of being thought. "Because I came here to end something," he said, "and instead I found something, and I have spent 5 years believing that I didn't deserve to find anything." He paused. "Your daughter told me the ranch needed me. She was wrong about that. You didn't need me. You never needed anyone. You would have found a way with or without me. But I—" He stopped, rebuilt the sentence. "I needed this ranch. I needed what it still was, what you made it still be." Outside, a vehicle came up the access road. Both of them looked, old instinct, checking every approach. But it was just Pete Halverson from the neighboring property, turning around in the wrong driveway the way he occasionally did in winter when the county road iced over. He backed up and was gone. The ordinary world, continuing. Mara picked up the folder from the table and looked at the documents inside. The legal language was dense, but she could read the shape of what it meant. Protection, permanence. The thing she had been trying to build for 6 years, finally given a foundation that wouldn't shift. "There's a condition," Silas said. She looked up. He was not quite smiling, but something in his face was lighter than she had seen it. "I'd like to keep working, if you'll have me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Room and board," she said, "and whatever else you decide is fair." She set the folder down. She picked up the coffee pot from the stove. Always coffee, in this kitchen, always the thing that happened while the important things were being decided, and poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat down across from him at the table that had been the center of this house through everything it had survived. "The hayloft door is sticking again," she said. "I'll look at it this afternoon. The north pasture water line has been running slow. I think there's a partial freeze somewhere in the middle section. I'll find it. And Eli wants to learn to ride properly. Not just sitting on a horse being led around, but actually ride." Silas looked at her across the table, and the look between them had something in it that neither of them named yet, because some things didn't need to be named immediately. Some things were better allowed to grow at their own pace in their own season, the way the best things on this land had always grown. "I can teach him," Silas said. "Good," Mara said. She drank her coffee. He drank his. Outside the kitchen window, the winter sun moved through the sky the way it always had, indifferent to the drama of human lives, interested only in the turning of the earth and the slow, reliable arc toward spring. Vern Rucker's truck appeared at the gate that afternoon. Mara saw it from the porch where she was checking the propane gauge and felt the familiar tightening, the old readiness. But then something different happened, something that had not happened before in 2 years of this particular fight. Silas walked out of the barn and across the yard and went to the gate before she could move, and she watched from the porch as the 2 men spoke. She couldn't hear the words, only see the posture of it, Silas square and unhurried, with his hands at his sides. Rucker's body language shifting in the way of a man receiving information that changes the shape of what he thought he came to do. The conversation was brief. Rucker's truck left. Silas walked back across the yard. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at her. "He won't be back," he said. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the property has been restructured, that the auction is canceled, that any legal maneuver against the estate would be contested by the owner of record with the full resources available to him, and that his contact at the records office should probably find a different way to spend his time." Mara looked down at him from the porch. The winter light was behind him, and the mountains were behind that, enormous and permanent, and the ranch stretched away in every direction around them, all 200 acres of it, hers. "The owner of record," she said. "That would be me," Silas said. "For now." "For now," she agreed. He climbed the porch steps and stood beside her, and they stood together in the cold and looked at the land that had broken both of them in different ways, and that they were, against all probability, standing on together. In the kitchen, through the window, she could see Rosie drawing at the table, and Clara reading and Eli doing something deliberate and focused with a length of rope, practicing a knot Silas had showed him the week before. 3 children in a kitchen. An evening coming on. Wood stacked against the barn wall, the hayloft closed against the weather, the fence line straight and solid going east. Frost Creek had looked at Mara Calloway for 6 years and seen a woman running out of time. They were about to see something else entirely. Spring came to Frost Creek the way it always did. Not all at once, but in increments, like a person slowly remembering something they'd been trying to forget. First the light changed. Not warmer yet, not substantially, but longer. An extra 10 minutes in the evening that you noticed one day and couldn't unnotice after that. The way the days had been quietly stealing minutes back from the dark without announcement. Then the snowpack began its slow recession from the south-facing slopes, revealing the brown and gray of last year's grass underneath, flattened and patient, waiting. Then the mud came, which was its own kind of misery and its own kind of relief, because mud meant thaw, and thaw meant the hardest months were behind them. By the first week of April, there were mornings when Mara could stand on the porch without her heaviest coat. She noticed these things the way she had always noticed the ranch's seasons, with the practical attention of someone for whom weather was not atmosphere but information. But she noticed them differently now, and she had been honest enough with herself, in the quiet of early mornings before the house woke, to acknowledge the difference. There was something underneath the practical attention that hadn't been there before. Something that felt cautiously and without excess like anticipation. The ranch was alive in a way it hadn't been in years. It wasn't a single dramatic change, but an accumulation of smaller ones, the way the strongest structures were always built, post by post, wire by wire, decision by decision. The herd had grown by 4 calves over the winter, including December, who had survived her difficult entrance into the world and was now a sturdy, imperious creature who treated Rosie as a personal inconvenience and everyone else as beneath her notice. The equipment was running cleanly, the fences held, the mortgage was paid, the legal structure was settled, and the particular background anxiety that had run beneath every moment of Mara's days for 6 years had not disappeared. She was too honest a person to claim that, but had quieted to something manageable, something that no longer consumed everything else. Silas had stayed. That was the simple fact at the center of everything, the load-bearing fact on which the new shape of the ranch rested. He had stayed, and he had worked, and he had done both of these things with the same unhurried consistency he'd brought to the east fence in December, without drama and without requiring acknowledgement. He was present in the mornings before anyone else was awake, and he was present in the evenings when the children did their homework at the kitchen table and the house had that particular alive quality that Mara had missed for years, without letting herself fully understand what she was missing. They had not talked directly about what they were to each other, not yet. There was an understanding between them that some things grew better in silence, that naming a thing prematurely was its own kind of pressure, and that they had both, in different ways, been made cautious by loss. But the understanding was there, present in the way they moved through the same spaces, in the way he handed her coffee without being asked, in the way she saved the last of the cornbread because he'd mentioned once that he liked it and she'd never forgotten. Clara noticed. She noticed everything and said nothing, which Mara recognized as her daughter's highest form of approval. Eli noticed in the way Eli noticed things, sideways, obliquely, filing the information in the careful record he kept of the world. He had started riding lessons with Silas in March, on the older quarter horse that Mara had always considered too spirited for a child, but Silas had assessed differently, and the assessment had been correct. Eli rode now with a natural stillness that Silas said he'd never had to teach. It was simply in the boy, already there, waiting for the right context. They rode the fence lines together on Saturday mornings when the ground allowed it, and Mara watched them go from the kitchen window and felt something she had not felt since Tom was alive, which was the particular piece of knowing that her son had a man to learn from. It was not replacing Tom. She was clear about that in her own mind, and she believed Silas was clear about it too. Tom Calloway was in the mountains and in his children's faces, and in the particular way the ranch was laid out, every decision about every building and fence line made by his hand. He was there. He would always be there. What Silas was something different, not a replacement but an addition, the way a new fence line didn't erase the old one but extended it. Rosie, for her part, had never made any of these distinctions. Rosie had decided in approximately the first week that Silas was hers, and that was the end of it. She brought him her drawings for review. She reported to him on the status of December the calf with a thoroughness that suggested she believed he needed regular briefings. She had taken to sitting beside him at dinner with the proprietary contentment of a child who has identified her people and settled in. Silas received all of this with a seriousness that Mara found quietly devastating. Not the performed seriousness of an adult humoring a child, but the actual seriousness of a person who understood that being chosen by a child was not a small thing and should not be treated as one. He had lost a son. Mara knew this. She carried the knowledge carefully, the way you carried something fragile, aware of it always, handling it with attention. She did not press it. She did not reference it. But sometimes she watched him with Rosie or with Eli and saw something in his face that existed in the country between grief and gratitude. And she understood that healing was not the clean, linear process that people who hadn't needed it tended to assume. It was more like the fireweed. It grew in the wreckage, in the disturbed ground, in the places that had been burned. And it was not a pretty flower so much as a persistent one, turning up in the least likely places with a stubbornness that was almost aggressive. The fireweed came to the ranch in May. It was Rosie who found it first, which was fitting. She came running from the direction of the old foundation, the stone outline in the east field where a structure had stood before Mara's time, before Tom's time, before anyone she knew, with the particular velocity of a child in possession of urgent news. "There's purple flowers," she announced, arriving at the porch steps breathless and certain. "By the old rocks. They just came. There wasn't any yesterday." Mara was mending a bridle on the porch, and she looked up at her youngest daughter's face, which was lit with the uncomplicated delight of someone who had not yet learned to assign complicated meaning to beautiful things. "Fireweed," Mara said. "Is that the name?" "That's the name." She set the bridle down. "Show me." Rosie took her hand and pulled her across the field, across the bright new green of April grass, toward the old foundation at the east edge of the property. And there it was, a cluster of fireweed, deeply purple pink, pushing up through the disturbed ground around the old stone foundation with that characteristic audacity, growing precisely where nothing had grown for years. Mara stood looking at it for a moment. She knew what the old foundation was. She knew it because Silas had told her, on one of the evenings they'd sat together after the children were in bed. In the careful way he'd been slowly, incrementally telling her the things she'd asked him to tell when he was ready. The foundation was all that remained of the house that had burned 5 years ago. The house where his wife and son had died. He had cleared the debris himself in the weeks after, before he'd left. Some final act of maintenance that he couldn't explain, couldn't stop himself from doing, the hands needing to do something when everything else was helpless. He had never gone back to it. Not once in the months he'd been at the ranch. She had watched him navigate the property with the unconscious precision of someone who has mapped the location of a wound and learned to root around it. She heard his boots in the grass behind her before she heard Rosie announce his arrival. "Silas, come look," Rosie said. "Purple flowers." He came to stand beside them. He looked at the fireweed growing out of the old foundation's disturbed ground. And Mara looked at his face, and what she saw there was something she would carry for the rest of her life. Not grief exactly, though grief was in it, but the expression of a person receiving something they had stopped believing was possible, something the world was offering that they had not asked for and did not know how to refuse. "Fireweed," he said quietly. "Mom knows the name," Rosie said, with the satisfaction of someone confirming existing expertise. "It grows after fires," Mara said, "after any kind of disturbance. It's usually the first thing that comes back." He was quiet. He crouched down the way he did with Rosie at her level, looking at the flowers with a directness that was its own kind of courage. "Can I plant more?" Rosie asked. "Can we make more of them grow here?" He looked at her. "You'd want to do that?" They're pretty, Rosie said simply. And you can see them from the barn. Silas looked at the child for a long moment, this 6-year-old who moved through the world without armor, who had decided things were worth beautifying, and that beauty was a sufficient reason for action, and that no further justification was required. Yeah, he said very quietly. We can plant more. Rosie patted his arm with the matter-of-fact tenderness of the very young and ran back toward the house to inform Clara and Eli of the flower situation, leaving Mara and Silas standing together at the edge of the old foundation in the May afternoon light. You don't have to, Mara began. I know, he said. I want to. She stood beside him. The mountains were still snow-capped above the tree line, but the valley was green now, genuinely green, and the light had that particular quality of northern spring, crystalline and new, that made everything look slightly more real than it had the day before. She's good at finding things, Mara said. She's good at everything, Silas said. Don't tell her that. She already knows. He made a sound that was close enough to a laugh to matter. They stood together in the easy, settled way of two people who had moved past the stage of needing to be careful about standing close, and the fireweed grew at their feet in the ground where something had been destroyed, and neither of them said anything about what it meant because they both already knew. In June, the town of Frost Creek began to revise its understanding of the situation at the Callaway Ranch. This was not a sudden thing. Towns did not revise their understanding suddenly. They revised them incrementally as evidence accumulated and the original narrative became harder to maintain. The evidence accumulated in the way of small, visible facts. The fences were good. The herd was healthy. The Callaway children were at school on time every morning, fed and rested and doing well enough that Mrs. Archer at the elementary school had mentioned it specifically to Janet Pruitt at the feed store, which was how information moved in Frost Creek, in the specific current that ran from person to person through the places where people gathered. Mara noticed the shift the way she noticed the change in seasons. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small differences. Janet Pruitt stopped delivering warnings and started asking genuine questions. Pete Halverson from the neighboring property stopped by one afternoon not to check on a boundary issue, but simply to say that the ranch was looking well and that he'd heard good things about the new man working the place. Even Doris Fenner, who had been among the more vocal proponents of the opinion that Mara couldn't hold on, said something at the post office that was as close to an acknowledgement as Doris Fenner was constitutionally capable of producing. Rucker was gone. Not from Frost Creek. He still had his operations, his cattle brokerage, his clean truck, but from the Callaway situation, removed from it as completely as if a fence had been built between them, which in certain legal and practical senses it had. His partner Croft had apparently moved on to other opportunities. The contact at the county records office had quietly taken early retirement. The machinery of pressure that Rucker had assembled over 2 years had simply disassembled when its central assumption, that the property was vulnerable, had been disproven. Mara heard this through the same current that carried everything else in Frost Creek. She received it without celebration. She had learned, over 6 years, that the absence of a threat was not the same as safety, but it was a necessary precondition, and she would take it. What she was building now was something different from survival. That was the shift she hadn't quite let herself name until June, when she stood in the south pasture looking at the expanded grazing area that Silas had spent 2 weeks clearing and fencing, an addition that added 30 acres of usable summer pasture and would meaningfully change what the herd could sustain, and she understood that she was no longer just holding on. She was building forward. They talked about it that evening, she and Silas, sitting on the porch in the long June light, with coffee cups that had gone cool, because neither of them had thought to drink from them, both of them looking at the land in the particular way of people making plans rather than calculations. If we add 6 breeding pairs next spring, Silas said, and the pasture carries the way I think it will, you'd be looking at a meaningful increase in the fall yield. That's a significant investment up front, Mara said. The trust account, your trust account, which is yours, he said, with the patient firmness he always brought to this particular exchange, which had become a kind of recurring ritual between them. Which is yours because it is your money paid against your land over 6 years, and I will keep saying that until you stop arguing with it. I'm going to argue with it for a while yet. I know, he said. I factored that in. She looked at him in the evening light, this man who had come to her door in November with nothing, and had somehow managed to bring with him everything she hadn't known she was missing, and she felt that shift in her chest again, the one that had been happening with increasing frequency, the one she had stopped trying to push back down. "Silas," she said. He looked at her. He looked at Keek. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I want to say it plainly, because I have learned that plain is better than careful." He waited, with the attentive stillness she had come to know as his particular form of respect. "I'm glad you knocked on my door," she said. "I'm glad I opened it. Whatever else was complicated about the rest of it." She paused, finding the precise truth rather than the approximate one. "I'm glad you're here, not for the fence posts or the accounts or the legal work. For you. Here, on this porch." She looked at him steadily. "I wanted you to know that clearly." The evening was very still. In the pasture, the cattle moved slowly through the long grass. The mountains were pink at the peaks with the last of the day. "Mara," he said, and the way he said her name was different from how he'd said it the first night at the door. It had more in it now, carried more. The way a word accumulates meaning the more times it's been said between people who matter to each other. "You don't have to say anything," she said. "I want to." He turned to face her more fully. "I came here planning to close a door," he said. "Every door I had left to this life. I had convinced myself that was the right thing, the only thing that was left for me." He paused. "You didn't argue with that. You didn't try to save me. You just opened your kitchen and fed me beans and handed me a blanket. And somewhere in between that and the east fence, I stopped wanting to close the door." "Beans are powerful," Mara said. He almost smiled. "Apparently. Tom used to say I put something in them." "What?" "Stubbornness, probably. I put it in everything." He did smile then, fully, and it was still an unpracticed thing on his face, still something that arrived like it was remembering how, but it was real in the way that mattered most. "I'm in love with this ranch," he said quietly, "and I'm in love with those children, and I am in love with you, Mara Calloway, in a way I had stopped believing I had any capacity left for." He said it plainly, the way she'd asked for. "I wanted you to know that clearly." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then stay," she said, simply and completely. "Stay." "I'm not going anywhere." "I know," she said. "I want to hear it anyway." "I'm not going anywhere," he said again. "Not ever." She reached across the space between the porch chairs and took his hand, and he held hers in the way of someone who understood the weight of what was being placed there and intended to be worthy of it. And they sat together in the long June light, while the ranch moved around them in its ancient rhythms, alive and whole and going forward. By midsummer, the fireweed at the old foundation had spread. Rosie had made good on her intention, recruiting Eli and eventually Clara into what she had decided was a restoration project of the highest importance, sourcing additional seeds from the wild patches along the creek and introducing them to the disturbed ground around the old stones, with a seriousness of purpose that she brought to very few things outside of her drawings. The result, by July, was a stand of fireweed that was visible from the barn and from the kitchen window and from the north ridge when you rode the fence line on a Saturday morning. It was not a monument. It was not a grave marker. It was just flowers, purple-pink in the summer light, growing in the only place they could grow, which was the place that had been opened by destruction. Rosie had not understood any of that when she'd planted them. She'd planted them because they were pretty, and she could see them from the barn, and no further justification had seemed necessary to her. She was right. It wasn't necessary. The flowers grew regardless of whether anyone understood them. Silas went to the old foundation one morning in July. Alone, early, before anyone else was awake. Mara saw him go from the kitchen window, that particular stillness in his walk that she recognized now as not avoidance but intention. She watched him cross the field and stand among the fireweed and stay there for a long time with his head bowed and his hands at his sides. And she did not go to him because some things needed to be done alone, and she understood that better than most. He came back to the kitchen, and she handed him coffee and said nothing, and he held the cup in both hands the way she held hers in cold weather, an old habit, and he looked out the window at the field and at the flowers visible from here, purple against the green. "Thank you," he said. "Rosie planted them," Mara said. "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank her for me." "She'd rather you tell her yourself." He nodded slowly. "I will." He did that evening, crouching down to Rosie's level at the kitchen table with that naturalness of his that still moved Mara when she saw it, and Rosie received the thanks with the unself-conscious directness she brought to everything. "You're welcome," Rosie said. I'm going to plant more next year. Maybe we can put them all the way along the creek." "That's a lot of fireweed," Silas said. "That's okay," Rosie said. "We have a lot of space." He looked at this small, decided creature, and Mara, watching from the stove, saw his face do the thing it sometimes did, move through the complex territory of grief and love, and the particular gratitude of a person who has been given something they know they didn't earn, but has decided to receive it anyway, because refusing it would be its own kind of ingratitude. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We do." In August, Gerald Calloway called. Mara answered the phone in the kitchen and stood with her back against the counter and listened. He was stiff at first, the stiffness of a man who has been wrong and knows it and hasn't fully made peace with knowing it. He asked about the children. She told him. He asked if Eli had grown. She said yes, considerably. He was quiet for a moment and then said, with the effort of someone doing something that didn't come easily, that he thought Tom would have been proud of what she'd built. It was not an apology exactly. It was the shape of one, offered in the only language Gerald Calloway had available to him. "He would have been proud of all of us," Mara said. "Including you, if you'd let him." Another silence. "The offer stands," she said. "Come as family. Come for the children. They deserve to know their uncle." He said he might take her up on that. She said the door was open. She hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a moment, and Silas came in from outside and read her expression with the accuracy that came from months of paying attention to a person. "Gerald," he said, "he might come at Christmas." He considered this. "How do you feel about that?" "I feel like Tom's children should know Tom's brother." She paused. "And I feel like people deserve the chance to become different than they've been." He looked at her for a moment. "Speaking from experience?" "Speaking from experience," she said. He came to where she was standing, and the kitchen was warm, and the window above the sink showed the summer ranch in its fullest abundance, green and gold, the mountains beyond it clear and enormous and permanent. He took her face in his hands, carefully, the way he did everything, with attention, without performance. And he kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the kitchen absorbed this the way it absorbed everything that had ever happened in it, everything that had been decided at the table and endured by the window and survived by the stove, adding it to everything it already held. Summer turned and the ranch stood. Not perfectly, never perfectly, because this was Montana and this was ranching, and perfection was a category that didn't apply. There were hard days and equipment failures, and one memorably terrible week in August when a section of the new south pasture fence came down in a windstorm, and the repair took 3 days and all 5 of them working in rotation. There were account books that still required careful tending and decisions that kept Mara up at night and mornings when the weight of everything was still heavy enough to feel in the bones. But the ranch stood, and it stood differently than it had in November, when winter was closing in and the money was nearly gone and the town had already written its ending for her. It stood with something underneath it now that hadn't been there before. Not certainty, because certainty was not the gift this life offered. Something closer to foundation. Bedrock. The knowledge that what held it up was not one person's will alone, but the accumulated choices of people who had decided, each in their own way, that this place was worth fighting for. Frost Creek noticed. The town that had watched Mara Calloway for 6 years with the patient, slightly mournful attention of a community waiting for an expected outcome, looked up one summer morning and found that the outcome it had expected wasn't coming. The widow who should have sold, the ranch that should have failed, the stranger who should have been exactly what he appeared to be. Instead, all 3 of them had become something the town hadn't had a category for. It found one eventually. Towns always do. They became, in the ordinary way of things that stop being remarkable and start being simply true, part of the story Frost Creek told about itself. The Calloway place. The woman who held on. The man who came back. Clara left for her first year of high school in Billings in September, living with a cousin of Mara's during the week and coming home on weekends, and the adjustment was enormous and ordinary and entirely survivable. She called every evening without fail. She was, her teachers reported, formidably capable. This surprised no one who knew her. Eli rode the fence lines on Saturday mornings with a competence that made Silas, who did not give praise easily or without meaning it, tell Mara privately that the boy was a natural. He was also, at 10, beginning to develop his father's particular quality of stillness, the ability to be fully present without requiring the moment to be anything other than what it was. Mara watched her son become more himself every month and understood this to be the best thing a parent could witness. Rosie turned 7 in October and received, as her primary gift, a promise from Silas that in the spring she could help choose one of the new calves and name it herself. She spent 3 weeks deliberating possible names before settling on Marigold as a frontrunner, subject to change upon meeting the actual calf. The ranch expanded carefully and without overreach, in the way of something built to last. The south pasture held. The herd grew by the calculated number. The account books, for the first time since Tom had died, showed a year-end position that was more than survival. Not abundance, that was a word for other lives and other scales, but sufficiency. Solid, genuine sufficiency, with something left over for the unexpected. Mara sat at the kitchen table on the last evening of December with Silas across from her, and the account books closed between them, and the children asleep in their rooms and the fire low in the hearth, and the ranch quiet around them in the deep, specific quiet of a Montana winter night. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. Outside, the snow was falling the way it had fallen on the night he first appeared at her door. The same mountains holding the same enormous silence, the same cold pressing at the same windows. All of it the same. All of it completely different. She reached across the table and put her hand flat on the account book, on the numbers that finally told a different story than the one she'd been afraid of for 6 years. "We made it," she said. Not triumphantly, just truly. "We made it," he said. She looked at him across the table. This man who had arrived like weather and stayed like bedrock, and she thought about the evening she'd handed him a wool blanket and pointed him toward the barn, and told herself she was making a purely practical decision. She thought about the east fence post driven into frozen ground, about December the calf arriving in the cold, about fireweed in the ruins of something that had burned. She thought about all the ways a life could be destroyed, and all the ways it could insist on continuing anyway, finding the disturbed ground and pushing through it, finding the open door and walking in, finding the table with the lamp on and sitting down and staying. "Same time tomorrow?" Silas said, and the simplicity of it, the sheer ordinary future of it, landed on her like sunlight. "Same time tomorrow," she said. The fire settled in the hearth. The snow fell outside. The barn light was on. It was always on now, that rectangle of yellow against the winter dark. And the ranch stretched away in every direction, 200 acres of Montana ground that had broken people and buried people and been abandoned and reclaimed and fought for and held, standing now at the end of another year with the particular quiet dignity of something that has survived long enough to stop needing to prove it. The stranger who had knocked on her door in November had become the man across her table in December, and the table was the same table, and the kitchen was the same kitchen, and outside were the same mountains, and nothing was the same at all. That was the thing about this land, about this life, about the particular relentless, stubborn work of building something worth keeping. You started with what you had. You opened the door. You set another place at the table, and you found out, if you were very lucky and very honest and willing to do the hard thing when the hard thing was the only true thing left, you found out that what you had, all along, was enough. The snow fell on Frost Creek, and the ranch held, and the fireweed waited under the frozen ground for spring. It would come back. It always came back.